Here's a paradox. Of all the miracle weapons Hitler promised, only one actually worked exactly as advertised. It outran every Allied fighter sent to catch it, and it still couldn't save Germany, because the very speed that made it untouchable also made it useless at the one mission that mattered most. Today, the last surviving example sits inside the country it once secretly photographed. This is the Arado Ar 234. The miracle weapon that actually worked. By the final years of the Second World War, Nazi Germany's propaganda machine had made a habit of promising miracles. Wunderwaffen, they called them, wonder weapons, revolutionary devices, supposedly capable of single-handedly reversing a war that was, by any honest military assessment, already slipping irreversibly away from German control. Most of these promised miracles turned out to be exactly what skeptical observers suspected all along: rushed, unreliable, or simply too late to matter, more valuable as propaganda than as actual instruments of war. Here's what makes the aircraft at the center of this story different from almost every other item on that list. It worked, not in some limited, asterisked, technically functional under ideal laboratory conditions sense, but in the sense that actually matters in war. It flew real combat and reconnaissance missions. It did exactly what its engineers designed it to do, and it did so well enough that Allied fighter pilots simply could not catch it in a straight chase. By any honest technical measure, it was one of the very few Wunderwaffen that lived up to its own hype. And it still couldn't save Germany, worse, in its most desperate, most consequential mission of the entire war. The exact quality that made this aircraft so revolutionary, its blistering speed, turned out to be the very thing that caused it to fail completely. That is the story of the Arado Ar 234, the world's first operational jet-powered bomber and reconnaissance aircraft. And it is, in its own strange way, one of the most honest illustrations of a lesson war has taught over and over again. A brilliant piece of engineering, arriving too late and in too few numbers, can win every technical argument and still lose the war it was built for. It's a lesson worth holding on to as we trace this aircraft's path from drawing board to battlefield to museum display case, because almost every twist in this story bends back toward the same central idea. Speed, taken to its absolute extreme, turned out to be both the R-234's greatest gift and its most crippling limitation, depending entirely on what job it was being asked to do in any given moment. Understanding how the same design trait could make an aircraft simultaneously untouchable and useless is the key to understanding everything that happened to it between 1944 and the war's final collapse. Chapter 1. A regime running out of answers. To understand why an aircraft this advanced ever got built at all, you have to understand exactly how desperate Germany's strategic position had become by the middle years of the war. Between roughly 1940 and 1944, the military initiative that had defined the earliest, most successful phase of the Nazi war machine had steadily slipped away on nearly every front. Allied bombing campaigns were reaching deeper and deeper into German territory. Reconnaissance aircraft were mapping German positions, tracking troop movements, and gathering the kind of intelligence that made every subsequent Allied operation more effective and more dangerous to German forces. German commanders faced an uncomfortable, increasingly urgent problem. Conventional propeller-driven reconnaissance aircraft, however skilled their pilots, were simply not fast enough anymore to reliably survive contact with the increasingly capable fighters the Allies were putting into the sky. An aircraft that gets intercepted and shot down before it can return its photographs is not a reconnaissance aircraft. It's a wasted crew and a wasted airframe, and by this stage of the war, Germany could afford neither. What German high command needed wasn't just a faster camera platform. They needed an aircraft that could fly deep into contested airspace, gather precise intelligence on Allied troop buildups and invasion preparations, and get back out again without needing to fight its way through. An aircraft fast enough to simply outrun the problem entirely. rather than needing to solve it through armor or armament. That requirement is what led the German Air Ministry to open a design competition for a long-range jet-powered reconnaissance aircraft. Only one company submitted a complete proposal, Arado Flugzeugwerk. And with that single submission, largely by default rather than fierce competitive victory, the program that would become the R-234 was born. There's something worth noting about the state of German industry that this single detail quietly reveals. In the earlier years of the war, a request of this magnitude, an entirely new category of high-performance military aircraft, would ordinarily have drawn competing proposals from multiple major manufacturers, each racing to win a lucrative and prestigious military contract. By the time this particular competition was announced, German aviation firms were already stretched thin across dozens of competing wartime priorities, short on design talent, materials, and factory capacity. The fact that only a single company could even assemble a complete proposal says as much about the deteriorating state of the German war economy as it does about the technical difficulty of the requirement itself. Arado didn't win this contract through overwhelming competitive strength. It won because, in the German aviation industry of that specific moment, there was effectively no one else left standing to compete against. Chapter 2. Building an aircraft around one obsession chief engineer, Walter Blum approached the resulting design with a single, uncompromising priority that shaped absolutely everything about the finished aircraft: speed, pursued almost to the exclusion of every other consideration a conventional combat aircraft designer would normally weigh. Every exterior surface was engineered to be as smooth and drag-free as possible, minimizing anything that might slow the aircraft down, even marginally. And in a decision that would have been almost unthinkable for a conventional bomber or reconnaissance design of the era, Blum's team eliminated defensive armament entirely. No machine guns, no tail turret, no gunner's position, nothing. The aircraft's designers made a calculated bet that raw speed alone would provide better protection than any defensive weapon system could, and that every pound saved by removing guns and ammunition was a pound better spent on fuel, range, and velocity. The nose of the aircraft reinforced that same philosophy in a different way, built almost entirely from glass to give the pilot the widest, clearest possible field of view for reconnaissance work. A design choice that made the aircraft look almost fragile from certain angles. A greenhouse strapped to the front of a jet, prioritizing visibility and observation over any kind of physical protection for the man inside it. Think about the sheer conceptual boldness of that decision. Conventional military aviation wisdom, built up over decades of combat experience, generally treated defensive weapons as a non-negotiable baseline for any aircraft expected to operate over hostile territory. Blum's team was betting the entire program, and every crew that would eventually fly it, on the idea that this particular aircraft would simply never need to fight back, because it would already be gone by the time anything could catch up to it. That bet also carried an unusually personal weight for the men who would eventually sit in that glass-nosed cockpit. Removing every defensive weapon meant that if the underlying premise ever failed, if an enemy fighter somehow did manage to get within firing range, the pilot had absolutely nothing to fight back with. No tail gunner watching his back, no forward-firing weapon to use in a last-ditch defensive maneuver. Nothing but raw engine performance, standing between the aircraft and destruction. Every crew member who flew this aircraft into contested airspace was, in effect, placing complete faith in an engineering philosophy that offered no fallback option whatsoever if that philosophy ever proved wrong at the wrong moment. Chapter 3. Wheels that weren't there. The obsession with speed and range created a genuinely strange engineering problem that most casual observers, looking at photographs of the finished aircraft, would never guess existed. The fuselage section directly behind the cockpit, the space where a conventional aircraft might house its main landing gear, was instead almost entirely filled with large fuel tanks, necessary to give the aircraft the long range its reconnaissance mission demanded. That left no internal space for a traditional retractable landing gear system. Arado's engineers solved the problem with a solution that sounds, on first hearing, almost too strange to be real. The aircraft took off using a separate, detachable three-wheeled trolley called a Bugrad Startwagen, essentially a purpose-built launch cart that the aircraft rolled along on during takeoff and then simply left behind on the runway once airborne. Landing, meanwhile, was accomplished not with wheels at all, but with a retractable skid mounted beneath the fuselage, allowing the aircraft to slide to a stop directly on its belly. It's an almost audacious piece of lateral thinking. Solve a weight and space problem, not by compromising on fuel capacity, but by redefining what landing gear even means for this particular aircraft. And in isolated testing conditions, it worked well enough to prove the underlying concept sound. But pilots who actually had to land the aircraft using that skid described the experience in far less flattering terms. Like sliding on soap, an unnervingly unstable, difficult-to-control sensation that offered the pilot minimal directional authority during exactly the phase of flight. The final approach and touchdown, where precise control matters most. On an operational combat airfield, with limited runway space and other aircraft needing to use the same strip, a skid-landing aircraft sliding unpredictably down the runway created a serious recurring risk of blocking or damaging the field for everyone else trying to use it. The problem was serious enough that Arado eventually had to redesign the aircraft's fuselage to accommodate a more conventional tricycle landing gear arrangement on the upgraded R234B variant, an admission that one of the program's most conceptually clever solutions had, in practical combat conditions, simply not worked well enough to keep. There's a broader pattern worth noticing here, one that recurs throughout the R234's development history. A solution engineered brilliantly on paper, tested successfully under controlled conditions, kept running into the messy, unforgiving reality of actual operational use, cratered runways, exhausted ground crews working in dwindling daylight, pilots flying with minimal training and mounting exhaustion as the war ground on. The skid landing system wasn't a bad idea in isolation. It was a solution built for a level of operational precision and controlled conditions that wartime Germany, by this stage of the conflict, could rarely actually provide. Redesigning the aircraft to accept conventional landing gear wasn't just an engineering fix. It was an acknowledgement that elegant theoretical solutions needed to bend to the far messier realities of a collapsing war effort. Chapter 4. A machine built on borrowed time. Underneath all of this speed-obsessed design work sat a much more fundamental vulnerability, one that had nothing to do with aerodynamics or landing gear and everything to do with the basic chemistry of wartime industrial production. The R234 depended entirely on the Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engine, a genuinely revolutionary piece of propulsion technology for its era, and also a deeply fragile one. Jet engines of this generation operated at extreme internal temperatures that demanded high-quality heat-resistant alloys, specifically metals containing substantial amounts of nickel and other strategic materials, to survive sustained operation without breaking down. Wartime Germany, cut off from many of its pre-war international supply chains and facing mounting shortages of exactly these kinds of strategic materials, simply could not manufacture enough of the ideal alloys to build these engines to their intended specification. Engineers were forced to substitute cheaper, more readily available materials wherever the original design called for scarce heat-resistant alloys. The consequence was an engine that ran remarkably close to its structural limits under normal operating conditions, with a genuinely alarming service life. Somewhere between just 10 and 25 hours of flight time before the engine required a complete overhaul or outright replacement. Picture what that meant in practical terms for anyone trying to keep an R234 squadron operational. An aircraft that had flown the equivalent of perhaps a handful of combat missions might already need its engines pulled and rebuilt or swapped entirely. A maintenance burden that would strain any air force, and one that wartime Germany, already stretched thin on nearly every kind of resource, was in an especially poor position to sustain. And the problem didn't stop at material scarcity. The Jumo 004 engine wasn't exclusive to the R-234. It was also the power plant behind the far more famous Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, a program that German High Command treated as a higher operational priority. Every engine that rolled off a production line represented a contested resource, fought over between competing programs, with the R-234 frequently finding itself on the losing end of that internal competition for a supply that was already desperately inadequate to meet total wartime demand. Consider the layered irony sitting inside this single detail. An aircraft built entirely around the premise that speed alone could solve nearly every tactical problem it might face was, from the very beginning, dependent on an engine so structurally compromised and so contested in its supply chain that keeping any meaningful number of these aircraft flying at all was a constant, grinding struggle, a vulnerability baked into the airframe's very heart, invisible in any photograph, but arguably more decisive to the program's ultimate fate than anything the Allies ever did in the air. Picture what daily life looked like for a ground crew, responsible for keeping a handful of these aircraft operational under these conditions. Every flight had to be weighed not just against fuel availability and mission necessity, but against a running mental countdown of exactly how many hours remained before an engine reached the edge of its structural tolerance. A squadron commander deciding whether to authorize a mission wasn't simply asking whether the sortie was tactically worthwhile. He was asking whether it was worth spending some of an irreplaceable, rapidly dwindling reserve of engine life on this particular flight, knowing that a replacement engine, if one could even be found at all, might take weeks to arrive through a supply chain that was itself collapsing under the weight of Allied bombing and material shortages. That is an extraordinarily difficult way to run any air campaign, and it defined the R-234's entire operational existence from its very first combat sortie to its last. Chapter 5: Normandy, the first jet reconnaissance flight in history, despite every one of those underlying problems. When the R-234 finally did fly its first genuine combat mission, it delivered exactly the kind of result its designers had promised. On August 2, 1944, Lieutenant Erich Sommer flew a prototype R-234 on a reconnaissance mission directly over the Normandy front, the first jet-powered reconnaissance flight in the entire history of aerial warfare. Cruising at speeds up to 460 miles per hour, roughly 740 kilometers per hour, Sommer's aircraft comfortably outran the best fighters the Allies had in the sky at that moment. Aircraft like the Spitfire and the Mustang that had, up to that point, dominated nearly every aerial engagement they entered. Think about what that mission actually represented from the perspective of Allied commanders on the ground, utterly unaware that anything had even happened above them. An aircraft had flown directly over one of the most heavily contested, most intensely monitored stretches of airspace in the entire war, photographed Allied invasion buildup and logistics in detail, and simply flown home again, untouchable, uncatchable, gone before any conventional fighter could even complete an intercept. Sommer returned with what were, by contemporary standards, extraordinarily sharp, valuable intelligence photographs documenting Allied activity in the invasion zone, delivered by an aircraft that no Allied pilot in the sky that day had any realistic chance of stopping. For one brief, genuinely remarkable moment, this was exactly the miracle weapon the German High Command had been promising. It worked precisely as designed, against precisely the kind of high-value, heavily defended target it had been built to penetrate, and it proved conclusively that jet-powered reconnaissance wasn't a theoretical concept anymore. It was a demonstrated, operational reality, flying directly over the most consequential military operation currently underway anywhere on Earth, and coming home untouched. It's worth imagining the moment from the perspective of the intelligence officers who received Sommer's photographs afterward. Every prior reconnaissance flight over a target this heavily defended had carried real risk of loss, real uncertainty about whether the mission would return usable results at all. Here was a complete set of clear, high-value photographs, delivered without a single close call, without the aircraft even being seriously threatened during the entire mission. For a German intelligence apparatus that had grown accustomed to reconnaissance missions being contested, costly, and unreliable, the sheer ease of Sommer's flight must have felt like a genuine glimpse of a different kind of war. One where speed alone could simply erase entire categories of risk that had defined aerial reconnaissance for the previous 5 years of conflict. If the story had ended there, the R-234 might be remembered purely as a triumph, proof that German aerospace engineering, even in the war's darkest and most resource-constrained years, could still produce something genuinely ahead of its time. But the war wasn't done asking things of this aircraft that it had never actually been designed to do. Chapter 6. Forced into a role it was never built for. By late 1944, with Germany's military situation deteriorating on every front and conventional bomber forces increasingly decimated by Allied air superiority, High Command made a decision that put enormous strain on the R-234's original design philosophy, converting it, at least partially, into a bomber. This was, in a very real sense, asking the aircraft to become something fundamentally different from what it had been built to be. The R-234 had no internal bomb bay. There had never been a reason to design one into an aircraft conceived purely as an unarmed, high-speed reconnaissance platform. Retrofitting the aircraft for a strike role meant mounting bomb racks externally, hanging ordnance beneath the fuselage and wings rather than carrying it internally. That single adaptation quietly undermined the entire premise the aircraft had been built around. Every one of Walter Bloom's original design decisions had been calculated to minimize drag and maximize speed. The smooth surfaces, the absence of any external protrusions, the entire aerodynamic philosophy of the airframe. External bomb racks, no matter how carefully positioned, introduced exactly the kind of drag-inducing surface irregularity the original design had been engineered from the ground up to avoid. The aircraft that had outrun Spitfires and Mustangs over Normandy just months earlier was now flying with a meaningful chunk of its signature speed advantage sacrificed. Simply to carry weapons, its airframe had never been designed to accommodate in the first place. It's worth pausing on the strategic logic, or lack of it, behind this decision. Converting an unarmed, high-speed reconnaissance aircraft into an improvised bomber wasn't the product of careful, forward-looking design planning. It was the product of desperation, a military leadership reaching for any available tool that might slow the increasingly unstoppable Allied advance, even if that meant using the tool in a way its own designers had never intended, and that measurably degraded the very quality that had made it valuable in the first place. This is a pattern worth recognizing, because it repeats constantly in the final years of losing wars. A scarce specialized asset, originally built to excel at one narrow task, gets pressed into an increasingly wide range of desperate improvised roles, simply because it exists and nothing better is available. Every one of those reassignments chips away a little more at the qualities that made the asset valuable in the first place, until what remains is something considerably less effective than the original design. Stretched thin across missions, it was never actually built to perform well. The R-234 wasn't unique in suffering this fate among German wartime technology. It's simply one of the clearest, most well-documented examples of exactly how that process played out in real time. These modified bomber role R-234 squadrons went on to fly missions supporting German ground forces during the Battle of the Bulge in the closing weeks of 1944. part of a last major German offensive that briefly reversed some Allied momentum in the Ardennes, before ultimately failing. The aircraft that had once photographed Allied invasion preparations from an altitude and speed nothing could touch was now, just months later, dropping bombs from an aircraft whose greatest advantage had been substantially compromised in order to carry them. Chapter 7, Remagen. Where speed became the enemy, nowhere did the tension between the R-234's original design philosophy and its wartime improvised bomber role play out more dramatically, or more consequentially, than at the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen in March 1945. When American forces captured this strategic crossing over the Rhine River largely intact, it became, almost overnight, one of the single most urgent targets in the entire European theater for German military planners. A Rhine crossing already secured by advancing American forces represented exactly the kind of breakthrough Germany's crumbling Western Front could least afford to allow to stand. German High Command threw every available resource at destroying that bridge, and that meant committing the Luftwaffe's jet squadrons, including R-234 units, to repeated, increasingly desperate bombing runs against it. Understand first exactly why this specific bridge mattered so intensely to German commanders in these final desperate weeks of the war in the West. Every other Rhine crossing that German forces still controlled had already been destroyed in a rolling campaign of demolitions, specifically intended to slow the Allied advance and force a costly, time-consuming opposed river crossing. The unexpected, largely intact capture of the Ludendorff Bridge represented a catastrophic failure of that entire defensive strategy. A single structure that had, almost by accident of timing and chaotic combat conditions, remained standing long enough for American forces to seize it and begin pouring men in armor across the Rhine days or weeks ahead of what German planners had assumed was possible. Destroying that one bridge wasn't simply a tactical objective. It represented, for German commanders staring at a rapidly collapsing Western Front, one of the last remaining opportunities to buy back time that had already, in every practical sense, run out. And here is where the aircraft's single greatest strength turned, with an almost cruel irony, directly into its most consequential weakness. Bombing accuracy in this era depended heavily on a pilot's ability to visually track and aim at a target through a bomb site during the final seconds of an attack run, a task that becomes exponentially harder the faster an aircraft is traveling. At the speeds the R-234 was capable of, speeds that had made it untouchable over Normandy just months earlier, pilots found it extraordinarily difficult to precisely aim at a comparatively small, narrow target like a single bridge span, using the periscopic sighting systems available to them. The bridge simply flashed past too quickly to allow the kind of careful, deliberate aim that precision bombing against a target that size actually demanded. Despite flying multiple dangerous bombing runs directly into an increasingly dense wall of American anti-aircraft fire, specifically massed to defend this now critical crossing, not a single bomb dropped by an R-234 during these attacks scored a direct hit on the bridge itself. The single quality that had made this aircraft revolutionary, speed so extreme that nothing could catch it, was the exact same quality that made it fundamentally unsuited to hitting a small, precise target under pressure. Picture the actual physics working against these pilots in the final seconds of each run. At a typical R-234 attack speed, a narrow river bridge spanning perhaps a few hundred feet would fill a pilot's forward view for only the briefest fraction of a second before the aircraft had already screamed past it. There was no meaningful window for the kind of careful incremental aiming correction that precision bombing against a target this size normally required. The sort of extended, steady approach that slower, purpose-built dive bombers of the era were specifically designed to provide. Every R-234 pilot attacking Remagen was, in effect, trying to thread a needle while sprinting past it at nearly 500 miles an hour, with American anti-aircraft crews below filling the sky with flak specifically calculated to break up exactly this kind of low-altitude attack run. Compounding the difficulty, the periscopic sighting systems fitted to these aircraft for bomb aiming had themselves been adapted rather than purpose-built for this specific high-speed strike role, adding yet another layer of imprecision to an already nearly impossible targeting problem. Multiply that single difficult pass across mission after mission, squadron after squadron, and the result was an unbroken string of near misses. Bombs fell close to the bridge, some devastatingly close, kicking up spray and debris along the riverbanks and structure, terrifying and endangering the American engineers and troops working to reinforce the crossing. But none of it translated into the one outcome that actually mattered strategically: a direct hit capable of collapsing the span itself. Sit with the full weight of that irony for a moment, because it's the entire story of the R-234 compressed into a single failed mission. An aircraft engineered from its very first sketch to be uncatchable was asked, in its most strategically important combat moment of the entire war, to do something that required being controllable and precise instead. And it simply couldn't reconcile those two fundamentally opposed requirements. Being too fast to be shot down and being fast enough to accurately hit a bridge turned out to be two very different engineering problems. And the R-234 had only ever been built to solve one of them. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen eventually collapsed on its own, days after American forces had already used it to move substantial forces across the Rhine, undermined by structural damage from the fighting and prior demolition attempts, rather than by anything the Luftwaffe's jets managed to accomplish. Germany's fastest, most technologically advanced aircraft had thrown everything it had at the single target that might have mattered most in the war's final months, and it had failed completely, defeated not by enemy fighters or by mechanical failure, but by the mismatch between what the aircraft was built to do and what this particular mission actually demanded of it. There's a bitter symmetry worth noticing here, one that closes the loop, opened back at Normandy. The same aircraft that had proven, over the invasion beaches in August 1944, that extreme speed could make a mission essentially risk-free, was now proving the exact inverse lesson less than a year later, that extreme speed could make a mission essentially impossible to complete successfully, depending entirely on what kind of precision the task actually required. Two missions, flown by the same aircraft type, separated by only a handful of months, one a total, uncontested success, the other a total, repeated failure. And the single variable that explains the difference wasn't the skill of the pilots or the courage of the crews. It was simply the nature of the target and whether raw speed happened to be an asset or a liability against it. By the time the Remagen bombing runs had run their course, German commanders had effectively exhausted their best available option for eliminating the bridgehead from the air. What remained were increasingly desperate ground-based efforts and, eventually, simple resignation to the fact that American forces now had a secure, if temporary, foothold across the Rhine, a strategic setback that the Luftwaffe's fastest, most advanced aircraft had proven powerless to reverse, for reasons that had nothing to do with courage or effort and everything to do with a fundamental mismatch of tool and task. Chapter 8. Too few, too late, even setting aside the specific failure at Remagen. The R-234's broader impact on the war was always going to be limited by simple arithmetic. Roughly 250 examples of the aircraft were ultimately built, a modest number by the standards of major wartime aircraft production programs, and one that overstates the aircraft's actual operational impact even at that. The number of R-234s that genuinely made it into the air on combat sorties was considerably smaller still, throttled at every stage by the same underlying resource crises that had shaped the aircraft's entire development. Chronic shortages of the fragile, short-lived Jumo 004 engines, dwindling fuel supplies as Germany's fuel production and distribution networks collapsed under sustained Allied bombing, and a rapidly shrinking pool of trained pilots as Germany's overall military position deteriorated through the war's final year. Consider the almost tragic mismatch at the heart of this story. Here was an aircraft that had genuinely solved the technical problem it was designed to solve, that had demonstrated real, tangible military value in actual combat conditions, arriving into a wartime industrial and logistical system that was by this point simply incapable of producing, fueling, or crewing it in numbers anywhere close to what might have made a meaningful strategic difference. The R-234 wasn't defeated by a design flaw. It was suffocated by the collapsing industrial and logistical foundation of the country that built it, a genuinely capable weapon, arriving into a war that no longer had the resources left to properly wield it. No number of individually brilliant engineering decisions, the drag-minimized airframe, the visionary, if flawed skid landing system, the raw speed that had once made an entire generation of Allied fighters irrelevant, could compensate for a production and supply system that had already, by the war's final year, ceased to function at the scale modern warfare actually required. The R-234 remains one of the very few Wunderwaffen that genuinely worked as advertised. It still could not, by itself, change the outcome of a war that had already been decided by industrial capacity, fuel reserves, and manpower long before the aircraft's speed or its bombing accuracy ever entered the equation. There's a broader historical lesson worth drawing out of this specific mismatch, one that extends well beyond this single aircraft, or even this single war. Military technology doesn't win wars in isolation. A revolutionary weapon delivered into a system that can no longer produce, fuel, or crew it in meaningful numbers is not really a decisive weapon at all. It's a demonstration, a proof of concept, arriving at exactly the moment it can no longer matter in the way its designers originally intended. The R-234's engineers solved an extraordinarily difficult technical problem under brutal wartime constraints, and their solution genuinely worked. But engineering brilliance and strategic relevance are not the same thing, and by 1944 and 1945, Germany's collapsing industrial base had already made the second one effectively impossible to achieve, no matter how impressive the first one turned out to be. Closing the last one standing, in the last place, anyone expected today, only a single complete Arado R-234 survives anywhere in the world. It sits preserved and on public display at the Smithsonian's Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center in the United States, the very nation whose invasion preparations this aircraft's earliest missions had been built to secretly photograph, and whose forces at Remagen it had once, unsuccessfully, tried to bomb into stopping. There's a particular kind of irony worth sitting with in that final resting place. An aircraft born from Nazi Germany's most desperate wartime engineering ambitions, designed explicitly to outrun and outmaneuver Allied forces, now exists as a static, silent museum piece inside the borders of one of those very Allied nations, preserved not as a weapon anymore, but as a historical artifact, studied and admired by the descendants of the people it once flew secret missions against. Visitors who walk beneath that surviving airframe today, admiring its smooth, drag-minimized surfaces and its strange glass nose, are looking at the physical remnant of a program that briefly, genuinely worked exactly as its engineers hoped, and that still couldn't overcome the collapsing nation that built it. It is one of the rare artifacts in any war museum where the object itself tells two contradictory stories simultaneously. Proof of remarkable technical achievement under nearly impossible wartime conditions, and proof that achievement alone was never going to be enough to change how the underlying war actually ended. Every rivet and smooth-riveted panel represents genuine engineering triumph. Every empty space where a defensive gun should have been, every mismatched detail of an aircraft cobbled together from substitute alloys and scarce engines, tells the other half of the story of a country that no longer had what it took to build enough of even its very best ideas. Step back and consider the full shape of what the R-234's story actually proves. Here was a genuinely revolutionary piece of aviation engineering, the world's first operational jet bomber and reconnaissance aircraft, capable of outrunning every fighter the Allies could put in the sky, built by engineers working under the impossible pressure of a collapsing war effort and severe material shortages, who nonetheless managed to solve the core technical problem they'd been assigned. And none of that mattered, in the end, because the aircraft arrived too late, in too small a number, dependent on an engine too fragile to sustain, inside a nation that no longer had the fuel, the pilots, or the industrial capacity to actually use what its own engineers had built. The R-234 didn't fail because it was a bad aircraft. It failed because being an excellent aircraft was never going to be enough, arriving as it did in the last desperate months of a war, already lost on every front that actually mattered. Sometimes, the most instructive stories in military history aren't about weapons that didn't work. They're about the ones that did, and still weren't nearly enough.